Does it work? Yes. So, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the third and final debate, the ultimate debate, so to speak, with our two speakers, Francis, not Cheneval, I have to apologize for that, but Cheneval, yeah, from the University of Zurich, and José Luis Martí, Joseph Lluís, okay, good. José Luis Martí is associate professor here at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in the philosophy of law, and he's also university commissioner for the Planetary Wellbeing Strategic Initiative, I learned. You were. Okay, you have to tell us more perhaps in the discussion about that. And his research topics are deliberative democracy, legal republicanism, citizen participation, and many other areas of political philosophy. And he also is now, this is I hope current, leader of the Global Democracy Project at the UPF, yeah, which tries to think about how should we democratize global, national, transnational institutions, and what global governance could look like, what its limits and its proper topics would be. Is that right? Good, thank you, welcome. And on my left side is Francis, as I said, Cheneval from the University of Paris, where he is a chair in political philosophy. And he's also excellent for our topic today because he's working on democracy theory. I think you have coined the term democracy for the kind of countries that are multinational and have to comprise different kinds of nations or demos in them. And he's also working on justice and property rights and the history of political thought. So the right intersection to talk about Kant and political philosophy today. He's currently leading two research projects, if I found that out correctly. One on the integrity of research, particularly for junior researchers, if I understand that correctly. It's over. You have to update your web pages, people. And then something on the anatomy of financial risk. That is always important. So thank you very much. And our first speaker will be Francis.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for having me. Thank you, Goethe-Institut, Ateneo Barcelonès. Thank you for being here. Yeah, so my name is written right. It's important in education, as in spelling, that not only you have to do the right things, but in the right order. That is very important also for education, I think, and that's our topic tonight. So to get us started as a conversation, let me suggest a brief comparison and opposition between the project of education to citizenship in a particular political community, particular republic, as has been prominently proposed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his later writings, with a Kantian cosmopolitan project of education to humanity, as we have heard about last night a lot already, and I would like to briefly mention a couple points today. And my point here tonight, to get us started, is to suggest that those two projects are individually necessary, but only jointly, at best, sufficient to achieve, global democracy, as José Luis is also working on, or the ideal that I think Kant has been writing about. So let me start with a quote. There are no French, Germans, Spaniards, or even English today, no matter what anyone says. There are only Europeans. And this is not the triumphant exclamation of a president of the European Commission about the success of European integration. It is the exclamation of deep regret written by the late Rousseau in the 1770s. Rousseau laments that there are no republics in Europe and no citizens. Nobody has love of country, knowledge of particular customs. Nobody upholds institutions as their own institutions. We only have a commercial European identity, according to Rousseau. And what he suggests in this writing on Poland, on the Polish government, from where the quote is taken, is a public national education where children, students learn the geography of the land, the language of the land, the customs, the institutions, the functioning of the institutions, where they learn to love their country, to where they learn participatory engagement to uphold those republican institutions that are needed to produce and reproduce the republic. And this project of the late Rousseau is a very stark contrast to an earlier project of his, which I'm sure you know about and we talked about last night. It's the Émile, where a private tutor educates Émile to become a human being. Not a citizen, but a human being. And this Émile is shielded off from society because, according to Rousseau, society at the time was corrupt. And the worst thing you could do is let your children get into the hands of the government and then being instrumentalized and indoctrinated by the dictators and monarchs of the world. So that's the Émile. Now, the late Rousseau opposes to that, and he hopes that Poland can do better. And so he proposes to Poland public education, national education, where students learn about their country, etc., as I've said before. And Kant picked up this project from the Émile, and this brings me to the Kantian project, which is, as we have heard it last night, Kant brushes away the family, he brushes away the state, because those two institutions will, they will teach children some sort of nepotism and instrumentalize them to become subjects of the prince, but will not educate them to become human beings, and will certainly not achieve this moral education to humanity that Kant proposes in his cosmopolitan education. I can give you another quote from Kant to suggest this. Sorry. Parents are concerned with their house, princes with their state. Neither has as its ultimate end the greater universal good, nor the perfection to which humanity is destined and for which it is indeed disposed. The economics of an educational plan should be conceived in a cosmopolitical spirit. That's Kant's project, not to educate subjects or family members, but members of the humankind who care about the universal common good, etc. Okay, so if we oppose those two projects, the Republican project to citizenship in a particular national political community and the cosmopolitan project, what can we say? Well, as you know, the later Kant in 1795, he wrote this project towards perpetual peace, in which he designs sort of the structure of a just world order, and the first definite article there states, well, all countries, all political communities should become republics. They should move away from dictatorship to become republics. Second, those republics should form a covenant, a federation of republics. Thirdly, they should guarantee to the citizens of all the other republics certain fundamental rights, which Kant called the cosmopolitan rights. By the way, such a cosmopolitan right I enjoy right here, speaking in Spain, my mind freely. You don't have to show a Spanish passport to speak my mind freely here in Spain. That's because Spain, as any other decent republic, guarantees fundamental rights of freedom of speech also to foreigners. And that's what I'm enjoying here today. So you see, Kant needs republics in his political design, but as I would say, he doesn't give us. In his theory of education, he brushes away family and state. He doesn't give us a conception of education to become citizens of a particular republic. That is lacking, and I think if we want to fill this gap, we have to turn to other thinkers such as Rousseau, the later Rousseau in his treatise on the government of Poland. And I think that's why I'm saying, it's necessary to have this Rousseauan conception of national public education. Most countries today, democratic countries, as Spain and many others, Catalonia, we have public education where the children, the students learn the national language, the local language, the geography, the history, the customs, etc. Everybody here is preparing what Rousseau suggested should happen. We should have fêtes républicaines, we should have republican feasts. Tomorrow Spain will, to the best of my knowledge, celebrate the national Spanish holiday, etc. So we all do that, and that seems to be necessary. But I think we all know that there's a danger in this, and some scholars have accused the late Rousseau of a dérive totalitaire, as a totalitarian drift, because it's easy to go from this kind of patriotism where students learn to uphold and love the land to nationalism where it becomes hostile towards others and exclusionary, etc. So I think it's clear that, and also in the context of the European Union, we need to educate students or children to become citizens, but also to the awareness to be citizens of a republic, which in turn is a citizen of a republic of republics, of an association of republics, as for instance is the European Union. Hence my point, I think both of those projects are necessary and they have to be complementary, and there has to be some sort of subsidiarity between the two. We need to educate young people to become citizens, to become active members of a local political community and uphold that community by their participatory engagement and action. But we also need to decenter them and take them a level higher to care about the well-being of all other republics and nations, and to achieve and to be able to uphold institutions which can solve higher level problems, such as we have many of those today. Hence my point, those two projects, the project to Republican citizenship and the project to cosmopolitan citizenship, are individually necessary and at best only jointly sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. And now, José Luis, please.
Thank you. Gràcies, moltes gràcies a tots per venir. Moltíssimes gràcies a Thomas per organitzar aquest esdeveniment al Goethe Institut, a l'Ateneu Barcelonès, a la Biennal del Pensament, en la que s'emmarca aquest cicle de conferències. Gràcies a tots vostès per venir. Les meves disculpes per haver arribat 3 minuts tard. Vinc de la boda del meu germà, que era fora de Barcelona, i hem tingut algun problema de tràfic, però afortunadament estic aquí. Gràcies també als traductors o traductores que faran un excel·lent paper segur. Explicaré el que volia explicar en anglès, perquè així també podem tenir el diàleg amb el Francis i espero que la traducció funcioni bé. So, I have 10 points. I will try to go as quick as I can, and then we have time for the Q&A, and then so we can discuss anything at length. And I would very much like to engage with many things that Francisca said. So my topic is a little bit different. So I want to focus on the education for democracy of our children. So what I call the fundamental question of democratic education is, as far as I can see, is how we should educate our children to become good citizens. That's a very important question and very hard question, so the answer is not obvious at all. That's point one. Point two, the Enlightenment was a philosophical project. You all know, I guess, that you are all familiar with that. It was a philosophical project that had this component, this element of optimism about human nature and about human beings. Basically, it was a quest for progress and cultural development and philosophical development. And for the Enlightenment, education was central, not only for Kant, but for all the Enlightenment thinkers, it was absolutely central. So the optimistic idea behind was that human beings have an extraordinary potential, but only education, as Kant puts it very clearly, only education, and one of an ethical and civic kind, can help us actually to flourish. That optimism was challenged by many traditions in the 19th century and 20th century and so on. But that was central for the Enlightenment, and I think that many people would like to kind of recover, restate, reactivate this kind of optimism, or at least we feel, or some of us feel, that we desperately need some kind of optimism in the world that we live today. So my third point, I will skip it largely because it was, I guess, I don't know how many of you were here yesterday. So we've been discussing in the cycle, in the series, extensively about Kant's ideas on education. So I guess that I will just assume that you might be familiar more or less with his central ideas on education, his ideas that we should educate our children to develop critical judgment, to have ethical views and ethical reasoning, to learn how to reason, how to use reason, and the public use of reason, as we were discussing last night. So I will just skip this point. If you want, I can come back in the Q&A, but I will assume that you have been discussing these or sufficiently familiar with that to go to the central point of how to educate children for democracy, for being good citizens. So Kant's views, the first thing, that's point 3, the first thing I would like to say is that Kant's views on democracy are kind of ambiguous. So he was definitely against democracy as it was understood in his time, meaning something like direct democracy. So he was much more in favor of the republic, as Francis was also saying, which included some vague idea of the mixed regime. There's a long tradition that comes from the Greeks, a long tradition about thinking about the mixed regime or mixed government, and about republicanism itself. But actually his ideas, and it's true that he defended the monarchy of King Frederick, and so he didn't have any particular issue with monarchy as such, even if he endorsed republicanism. But his ideas were largely democratic. And the least we could say is that it's obvious that all his political and moral ideas lie at the foundations of our modern view of democracy. So it's fully aligned with democratic values, with democratic principles, with the basic liberties and so on. His idea of human dignity, for instance, and the basic equal status of all citizens, which he acknowledges Rousseau for having been inspired about this idea. He claims that he learned everything about the equal status of human beings from Rousseau. That, of course, lies at the foundations, at the very basic level of how we understand democracy today. Or his commitment to the ideal of self-government, first of all individually, but also as an extension collectively, which of course fits very well with what we understand by democracy today. Or in the third place, and connected to that, his insistence on the importance of developing individual critical judgment, as I just said, and his particular view of the value of autonomy as absolutely central for any version of the good government. Now, point 5, in his pedagogical writings, Kant stated, and I'm quoting here, there are two human inventions which may be considered more difficult than any others. Two inventions more difficult than any other. The art of government, first of all, and the art of education in the second place. The two more difficult tasks or endeavors that we might have. Somehow for him, these two elements were kind of connected. And he added, people still contend as to their very meaning. He was saying this in the 18th century. We might probably say that we are still contending to the very meaning of the art of government and the art of education. It's not that we haven't done any progress. Let's hope that we have done something, but many of the fundamental questions are still open. He also adds, and I'm quoting him again, but he wonders, it's a question, but by whom is the better condition of the world to be brought about? By rulers, he asks, or by their subjects? By the government or those in the government, or by the people? Where should we focus our efforts on education? Where should we place our trust or our hopes in order to develop a good governance or a good democratic government? His answer was in both of them. So we need to invest in the education of both the rulers and the people. He was skeptical about the prospects of educating the rulers who, in his time particularly, they all came from the elite. He was skeptical about educating them in a deep understanding of the basic needs of the people. And that's why he thought it's absolutely crucial that we also educate the people to play a crucial role in the art of government. The fate of a good government, as well as the progress in our society, critically depends on every individual receiving an adequate education centered in developing people's autonomy, critical judgment, and civility. And among all the thinkers from the Enlightenment, in nobody like in Kant, or in Rousseau, or in Jefferson, I would name these three. I think that in nobody else in the Enlightenment, you can find so clearly this deep commitment with the education of everyone. Jefferson was the father of the first public system of education open to everyone in the state of Virginia in the history of humankind. Point 6. Kant's ideas, his emphasis on democratic education, extending education to everyone for the good of the government, and educating children as future good citizens, this idea, somehow, even if it has been very influential, but somehow it was lost, it got lost in the last 2 centuries. I have some hypotheses of why was that. The truth is that I take it to be a fact, we can discuss it if you don't agree, but I take to be a fact that in 2050 years, we haven't done too much progress in understanding much more concretely what it needs, what it requires to educate our children to become good citizens. So the general ideas, we all have them, we may agree with them, but going to the details and the concrete details, it's still very difficult. So why is that? If Kant was so influential and he set up the foundations of democratic thought in the years to come, and if many people were convinced of these basic ideas that we should invest heavily on the democratic education of our children, why we didn't make more progress on this? As I think, I have some hypotheses, I can just bring some of them, but so one of them is that during the 19th century, what we could see is a different notion of democracy developing. Well, first of all, there were some philosophical traditions in the 19th century, as you may know, like classical liberalism, as you might say, or neoliberalism, for which the government should be reduced to the very minimum, or Marxism on the other side, with very different insights. And you also had idealism, and you also had romanticism and nationalism, and different ideas of how to organize our political business that, in my view, they detracted from following Kant's path on this issue. And in addition to that, in the 20th century itself, you may be familiar with that point, especially after the 2 world wars, what we could see is other philosophical traditions such as existentialism or postmodernism being very, very pessimistic about the possibility of developing human virtues through education, right? So in a way, it was like the Enlightenment dream was broken. Perhaps forever, I hope that it's not forever, but for a while at least it was broken. Also, you can also find democratic thinkers influenced by Kant or not, but following some kind of, following this idea that it's central for our democracies to educate our children to become good citizens, such as John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. But the thing is, and it's important to mention him because it will connect with what we have today, which is the important part of what I want to say in the remaining minutes. John Stuart Mill, for instance, very famously stated that the only way, or perhaps the best way to learn how to become a good citizen is actually by participating politically. So it's something like learning by doing. Only when you can learn contents or knowledge or things in the school. You can be taught several things in the school, but only in the moment you enter into political participation and you start participating, then you can learn the important democratic values and principles that you need to learn to become a good citizen. So it's a kind of experiential learning, which is fundamental, but it's only one aspect of the whole education project. So let me go to point 7. I said I have 10, so let me go to point 7 and skipping a few parts. So all these factors combined, I was brief, but we can turn back in the Q&A. But all these factors combined may help to explain why this fundamental question of democratic education, as I called it, has been largely overlooked in the last 2 centuries. So of course, you may find many people stating that democratic education is crucial. I mean, many people. In these 2 centuries, you can cite dozens, hundreds of people saying this. The issue is that we are lost in the details. We don't know actually how to do it. It's very difficult to know how to do it. It's a very hard question. And one could have expected more progress in 250 years than we have done. So let's leave aside all my hypotheses about why we didn't make more progress. And let me just say, as an example, and trying to connect also with contemporary political philosopher, perhaps I guess that most political philosophers would agree with what I'm going to say. Perhaps the 2 most important political philosophers in the last 50 years have been John Rawls, the late John Rawls, the American political philosopher, and Jürgen Habermas. Both of them, Rawls and Habermas, they are Kantians. So if you study their theories, of course they disagree with Kant on many grounds, but they are essentially Kantians. So they develop a Kantian program for political philosophy. And for different reasons, I will not go into the details, but for different reasons, both of them stress the importance of educating our citizens, helping them to develop certain civic virtues or a sense of justice or some kind of commitment with the common good or the public good. So both of them stress the importance of this, but they don't tell us very much about how to do it. They don't give us guidance or concrete guidance about how to do it. Maybe it's not the task for philosophers, so maybe it's not something we should try to do. But the fact is that we haven't done it. Point 8. It's true that not all contemporary philosophy has remained silent about the details of this. So just to be fair, let me just mention, I mean, there are many authors who have written about this with great contributions. Let me just mention one of them, one of my favorites. Amy Gutman, the American philosopher, published in 1987 a book called Democratic Education, and it was an important contribution to the philosophical debate about how to educate our children politically. But the truth is that part of this literature is insisting all the time. We have a need for educating our citizens, which in today's world, with the social media, with polarization, with populism, with fake news, with all the social fragmentation that we are seeing around in pretty much every democracy in the world, it became more important than ever. So it has been constant through years that people thought that this is central and important. But perhaps nowadays we could feel that it's even more important than ever and more urgent and more critical to save democracy. I mean, Thomas said yesterday, we all know that democracies are in crisis. I don't know if we all know that, so we might discuss about whether they are. But yes, I mean, many people speak about the crisis of democracy, and it's important to realize that if democracy is going to be saved or preserved at some point, the role that citizens must play is absolutely critical. I mean, democracy cannot exist for conceptual reasons without citizens' commitment. So it's absolutely critical that we try to do better in developing this commitment by citizens. Point 9, it's important also to mention, again to be fair, that some schools are doing very interesting experiences or experiments in educating democracy to our children. So this needs to be acknowledged. But you know, I mean, if you are close to any school, any particular school or to the school system, you know that democracy is pretty absent of the curricula of our children, and this happens in many countries. Switzerland is an interesting exception, but it's pretty absent. And when it's not absent, totally absent, it's just one content among many others. So you put democracy at the same level as you could put physics or chemistry or, I don't know, international literature or things like this. Which maybe, I mean, I'm not saying that it should be, it should have any priority, but the fact is that in the exceptional cases in which you have democracy somehow being taught to our kids, it's just one content among others. And normally, in those occasions in which it's being taught, normally what, at least that's the experience largely in Spain, in the few attempts that we have done in the past to try to teach democratic values to our citizens, normally what we do is that we teach what the Constitution says, what are our rights, how the democratic system works, broadly speaking. And important as this is, because of course our kids need to be aware of all these things, that does not equate, is not the same as teaching democratic values and democratic principles. So what I want to say is that there's much more to be done. And even if we can discuss about this in the Q&A, even if it's true that there are many experiences here and there which are promising and interesting about how to teach democratic values, things like simulating governments or parliaments or simulating decision-making processes or visiting in person the institutions or things like this, even if there are these experiences, as far as we know, and as far as we can test the impact of them, the results are not what we expected. So the question of how to educate how to bring up our children from schools, but also from our families, how to bring them up and helping them to learn democratic values and principles remains largely an obscure question. So we don't have very concrete tools to focus on this question. Final point, and I come to an end. I think that we all might agree that one of the risks when we focus on this debate on how to educate democratically our children, one of our risks is that at some point some people might think that what we are doing is indoctrinating them. So there's a limit that any liberal citizen would agree on, which is that schools, public schools, but also schools in general, but particularly public schools, there's a limit on what they can do, and they should never fall into indoctrination. But when we talk about democratic education, and I think it's important to stress this point as well, when we talk about democratic education, we are not talking about indoctrinating our children in the sense as giving them any particular political view or ideology, or giving them a particular religious view or whatever. So it's not giving them any particular view. Yesterday we were discussing about how to develop critical thinking, how to help them to develop their autonomy, to have their own assessment of which of all the potential political theories, which of them they find more suitable or more correct. But this should be made compatible with being able to teach them the values, the democratic values. I've been talking about democratic values in these minutes without mentioning them, and I just assume that most of you know what I mean. Democratic values such as respecting the other citizens, such as finding equal value in all citizens, respecting their rights as equal rights, and so having respect for diversity, but also to engage in meaningful discussions with those who disagree with us. So what we have seen in the last 20 years in contemporary democracies, and we can all think on particular examples. I mean, Thomas yesterday put as a tweet by Donald Trump. So we can all think on particular examples of how our democratic politics is going in the wrong way in some respects. It's important to realize that what we are witnessing in democratic systems is a general phenomenon. It's not only exclusive of United States, definitely not exclusive of Donald Trump. You can find it everywhere. So just think on the social media. We had the hope that new technologies would bring up more information accessible to everyone than ever, more diversity of voices, more sources of information, more debate, more criticism of the right kind, so of the reasonable kind. And what happened was quite the contrary. I mean, not exactly the contrary, but it definitely social media didn't meet the expectations. And what we have seen is a very rapid deterioration of public debate in the public sphere. So, and I come to my final sentence. It should be obvious that any democratic system requires citizens of a certain kind. Not perfect citizens. I mean, remember Kant's absolutely central idea that we should think about government not assuming that people are angels, certainly not demons as well, but we are not neither angels nor demons, we are just regular people. So citizens would never be perfect, but we need citizens developing certain attitudes and values and principles. If we don't have that, democracy cannot last forever or for a long time. And perhaps let me end with this more optimistic vision, because I said we need optimistic visions here. So for the first time in history, we have citizenries so our citizens are more educated than ever. And it's true that despite all what I said, social media and the internet and digital technology brought up much more information available than ever. So the preconditions for making democracy evolve to a new stage, to make it progress, are there. It's not that they are not there. It's not that everything is terrible. But we need to, perhaps for that reason, perhaps because the fact is that people have a greater voice today, perhaps now we realize how important it is to have educated citizens. Democracy just 30, 40 years ago, it was highly representative and it was designed to work quite independently of what people thought or wanted to say. Today is not like that anymore. I think that's a good thing, but then we need to take into account the importance of democratic education. I don't have the answer to the fundamental question, so I prefer to put the question to you and have now an open conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, José Luis. So in philosophical discussions, we often are advised that before you challenge a certain person, you should make sure that you have understood their position correctly. And I will, of course, not rehearse all of your different arguments. I want to emphasize first that you answered the question, education for democracy, but how? In different ways, and interestingly different and complementary ways. Francis, if I understood you correctly, you understood the question as in the following way, namely, how should we balance in education for democracy the teaching of virtues and attitudes that belong to a national, republican, democratic context within a certain territory as members of a certain community, and how in particular we should balance here this with the more cosmopolitan ideas. And you basically try to bring Rousseau and Kant together, whereas you asked a slightly different question. You were also not excluding that democratic education might include cosmopolitan values, or to what extent it should do, but you asked a more practical question, namely how, or the psychological educational question, how should we actually proceed in school education and continuing education for achieving that people develop the right attitudes that are fundamental for acting not only as passive citizens, but as participating, active citizens of our democracies. Did I get that right? Roughly speaking. Yes. Good. Okay. That is always important. Now I want to challenge first Francis about Rousseau. You said at the beginning that Rousseau's claim about that there are no more Polish and French and German and Italian mentalities, that there's a lack of patriotic values, national bonds of identity, and a sense of community, and everyone is now a European. And you said that Rousseau didn't say that in a positive way, but that he complained that fact. And the context of that statement was obviously the Polish crisis, the fear that Poland would be split out, which it was then. but that he combined it with a claim of a hollow European identity. And I'm not sure I understand the reasoning behind Rousseau's, and I want you to help us here better. He complains about the absence of a national education that would help people to develop this kind of patriotic virtues, national bonds of identity, or a sense of community. But he says that the European identity that people have at that time already, he says they have the same mores, they have the same passions, the same tastes, almost as if that was a negative thing. Why not read it let's assume that Rousseau is right in the description, right, at that time already. That's already remarkable, actually. And one wonders why he doesn't come up with the idea, well, maybe there is actually something to the fact that people have developed the same mores, the same tastes, and the same passions in those different European countries. Why not turn the table on Rousseau and ask him, well, maybe that's just because there are actual humanistic ideas and ideals that are shared by us, and it's not at all true that a European identity, or more broadly speaking, a cosmopolitan identity, needs to be hollow. Please explain to us what the reasoning might there be.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't think we necessarily have to agree with Rousseau on this. I think what he means is, while there is an erosion or an inexistence of patriotic cultures, of republics, there is no replacement of that at the higher level. So, there might be European commerce, there might be European trade, et cetera, but there is no, and I think this is right, at his time, there is no European political project that replaces the lack of, let's say, a Catalonian, a Swiss, and a French republic with a European republic. And there is no spirit of citizenship at the time of Rousseau. So that's what he means. So and he had, he fought with his Enlightenment friends, Diderot, etc., who were cosmopolitans, and he told them, he always thought, well, cosmopolitans are just bad citizens. Because they do not uphold a cosmopolitan political community that's in existence, and so cosmopolitanism means to deny particular community without replacing it with a global community. And on that, I think he was right. And even today, of course, now we have a European Union, which I think is an incredible progress from the time of Rousseau. But you don't have a cosmopolitan republic where people uphold just institutions of the global political order. And so cosmopolitans, they don't care about the local, they forget about the importance of the local political community without upholding a global political community. That's Rousseau's bite. And I think there, I think he's right on that, he's right. So that's how he means it. And you can read Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, and of course, you travel to any city and you shop in Hennes and Mauritz, etc. That's the kind of thing that Rousseau doesn't like, about flattening, commercialized cosmopolitanism that leads to the loss of very many particular languages, cultures, traditions, customs, artisans, etc., trades, local trades, etc. That's what he means. And then he means the lack of a political project at higher levels.
But there is also a stronger claim. At one point you said that we can, Rousseau says, and I always have to figure out which parts of Rousseau's claims you are just reporting and which parts of them you make your own in your appeal for a balanced education of republican and cosmopolitan virtues, so to speak. There was also the additional statement that you said, or that Rousseau said again, Francis Rousseau, so to speak, that we can only be free within a republican community. Mm-hmm. Why would it be excluded that we could also be free under a European or another kind of transnational political organization? Why wouldn't that also be possible?
No, that cannot be denied. So, I don't think philosophy has anything to say about what's the ideal level of implanting the political community. And I think Kant is right. Ultimately, everybody has to be in a state of law with everybody else, and every particular political community has to be in a state of rule of law with every other particular political community. That's the end purpose. That is true. But where these political communities form, I don't think you cannot deduce this from any kind of philosophical reasoning. That's the result of respectful political negotiation and according to rules of collective decision making. In Switzerland, we formed the new canton of Jura. It's separated from the canton of Bern by a political democratic process, in which every municipality had to vote and sort out to which political level it wanted to belong to. And this is not something you anticipate from armchair philosophy, and saying, oh, this is how the map should be drawn. No, that's the result of on-the-ground political democratic negotiation.
Thank you very much. Jose, would you like to add something, given that you work on the global democracy project?
Yeah, it's not that I disagree entirely with Francis, but let's make it funnier. So by disputing a little bit. So I think that, so you seem to say that Rousseau was right in saying that cosmopolitans, they don't care about local governments or local politics. I totally disagree. I think that being cosmopolitan doesn't mean disregard the importance of local bonds. Actually, it might be the opposite. So you might think it's definitely a way of bypassing the state, not getting rid of the state, but bypassing it in the sense that definitely a cosmopolitan government or a global government at some point would require delegating some powers to the global level, which means reducing the powers of the state. But this might come at the same time that you make many other aspects of your political life even more local. I mean, of course, you live in Switzerland, which is almost an ideal case scenario for democracy and local participation and so on. But many other states, they have very little democratic participation at the local level. I mean, they might have much participation on trivial questions or non-important issues. But what I mean is that there's nothing implied in the sense that you defend some delegation of power to the global level. That doesn't imply that you need to disregard or have indifference about what happens in your town or region or whatever. And let me add something that I found particularly interesting in the last couple of weeks. So there's this important empirical study, because in the literature about cosmopolitanism and global democracy and all that, there's always a background assumption which everyone takes for granted. And the assumption is a matter of fact. So pretty much everyone takes for granted that citizens, as a matter of fact, human beings, they don't want to have a global government, that they are super happy by preserving their national states. Well, we need to take it as it is. I mean, it's just the first study that I know that has systematically studied this, and systematically might be actually discussed here, what means systematically. But this is a study of 84,000 interviews to people from 17 or 27 countries, those countries representing 50% of the population of the world, countries in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, western and eastern, and so having some kind of sample of the world. And the results is that, especially when you make a more interesting question, not simply whether you favor a global government, but whether you favor a global government that is democratic in nature and that deals only with global issues, meaning that is fully compatible with preserving states for all the other issues. You only delegate power to deal with some issues that are by nature global or planetary, then popular support for that is more than 60%. So this is only one first study. All what I want to say is that it's not obvious. I don't know how things were in the times of Rousseau or Kant. It's not obvious, and we should not take for granted that today people would not favor having some kind of global government in a way that is fully compatible with preserving national states. And therefore, the lessons from that for our education question would be, why not teaching both things at the same time? You should teach national culture, national values if you want, or the importance of arranging political things in your local government, national or regional or at the municipality level. And at the same time, you should teach our kids, as Kant defended, cosmopolitan values, the idea that all human beings are equally valuable, equally worth, and we should recognize that we all deserve more or less the same rights and obligations.
Yeah, I think that was exactly my point, that they are individually necessary and only jointly satisfactory. Yes. That was exactly the point I made. I couldn't agree more with you. And now how we bring this about is then where we have to discuss.
There's actually an interesting thought, which is unclear in Kant's famous essay on perpetual peace, which one of my professors said every educated human being should have read that, and I carry that recommendation on to the audience here. The second definitive article starts with the idea of a federation of free republics. And Kant seems to say at that point that nations do not want a world government and it would turn into a tyranny. But at the end of the argument in the same so-called second definite article, he says that as an ideal, we want a world republic, but because nations currently, right now, do not want that, we go for a federation of free republics. And cosmopolitanism could be understood in two different kinds of ways. It could be understood as a kind of ethical or anthropological cosmopolitanism where we just accept that we are all alike human beings with equal rights and all with certain potentials, different potentials, but all with potentials that we can and should develop, and we all deserve recognition and respect. That's ethical or anthropological cosmopolitanism, and then political cosmopolitanism would be the stronger claim that we ought to have a world republic, right? And the question here for me is, it seems that Kant acknowledges that at that time nations are such that they do not want to have a world republic as a matter of fact. But as an ideal, it would be the right principle. The question is, what would have to change for people to become more accepting of the idea of a world republic, and should we want that? Francis, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's about doing the things in the right order, and even if you could argue the point, the ideal is a world republic, the fact of the matter is that the only thing we have right now are particular republics at best. Most of them are still dictatorships. So wherever you want to get in the end, that's where you start. And so what you shouldn't do then is badmouth the republics we have just because they're not a world republic yet, but teach students to cherish what they have, namely particular republics, and cultivate them and engage in them with the idea, okay, but you have to go beyond. And the next step is not going to be, mind the gap, as the Metro says in London. The next step is not going to be the world republic. It's going to be, at best, maybe some kind of functioning European Union or regional union in any other part of the world. And then we should uphold those kind of institutions, and still by saying, okay, they might not be the true final purpose ideal, but that's the next step we can possibly achieve, and then you have to uphold those kind of institutions. So this Kantian imperative to leave the state of nature is a process, that is taken, it's level by level, has to be construed, and just by anticipating the end all the time, and saying, this is where we should be and we're not there yet, so okay, too bad. Be cynical about the rest is what we have to be afraid of and should avoid.
And that's exactly how we could teach it.
And that's where Rousseau comes in. He says, I don't agree with a lot of Rousseau, but I think he's right about this particularistic appeal to, okay, let's first learn, people are born into families. Let's first learn to live good in a family, and then in the village, and then in the nation, and then in the European Union, and so forth. And Kant very much subscribes to this idea of subsidiarity when it comes to the process. And then, he's still debatable. Does he want the world republic, or is it just a free association of republics if they have a rule of law? And that's probably good enough for as much as philosophy can say about it right now. But important is to have this sort of process thinking and starting from where we are.
Thank you.
Yeah, so 3 things. So first, as you know, Rousseau thought that democracy was only compatible with local governments, so relatively small territories. So of course, if you think that, then this gives you a very strong reason to oppose any way of scaling up government, because if it can't be democratic, then it's very difficult to legitimize it. So I think we don't have reasons anymore to support that view, and I think that in the same century he lived, the creation of United States proved him wrong, and I think that it's very far from ideal, but I think that nobody would say that United States was not or is not a democracy in some level, despite the fact that it's a very big territory. So we found a way to build up democracy at bigger territories or greater territories, and I think we are confronting right now a similar challenge. So the challenge is how to build up democracy at the global level. So the second thing regarding Thomas' question, it's very difficult to know what's the distinction between a world republic and a federation of states. So you might think, is United States a republic or a federation of republics? Or it's Switzerland or Germany, any federal government? Is it a republic, one republic, or a federation of republics? It's probably both, and that's the nice thing about federalism. But this connects with the third point I wanted to stress. Something I think I was not here for the very last part of yesterday's discussion in the second talk, but maybe it came out at some point, but otherwise we haven't mentioned. But I think that one of Kant made many important contributions. One of his philosophical contributions to political theory that is quite often missed, overlooked, is that he had a different idea of what a regulative ideal is, very different to Aristotelian ideas of perfection or other precedents in the history of philosophy. And his notion of regulative ideal, like having a world republic eventually at some point, his notion of a regulative ideal is that you need to have some idea of the horizon that you might want to approach. But precisely because we are very far from getting there to that horizon, and this might apply to having a world republic, but it might well apply exactly as well to having a perfectly functioning democracy or to achieving perfect justice within a state. All these are regulative ideals. All our states are very imperfect, both in democratic terms or in justice terms or in many other respects. So we are so far from approaching or achieving any possibility of having a global democracy or a world republic, then that it's actually very difficult to know how it would look like. So when he referred to a world republic, he might be meaning that actually it might be a bad idea to try to reproduce what we had back then at the level of a state, but now at the global level. Yeah, everybody would agree with that today. For many reasons. One of them is that the danger of tyranny, of global tyranny, would be too great, right? So there would be no counterpower, and that's one of the reasons he mentions on perpetual peace. But why should we suppose that the challenge is actually to build up exactly the same kind of institutions that we have in the state now globally? That's not what we did in the 18th century when the Americans built up the first modern democracy. They created new institutions, yes, inspired in the history of Romans, whatever, but brand new institutions to cope with the challenge of creating a larger democracy. Similar challenge, as I said. Now we have the challenge to create that at the global level. Well, it's our task to figure out which kind of institutions we would need. And I guess that everyone would agree that it needs to be federal or confederal or territorially distributed, however you want to do it. But we don't know much more than that.
Isn't a very simple minimal condition for a world republic that it would have elections, at least like we do have in the European Union, to a central parliament where every vote counts equal, more or less? It's nowhere perfect. Whereas the United Nations is more like the model of a federation of free republics, not all republics, as Francis has pointed out, but of countries. And there, the representation only works through the channel of national governments and their representatives, rather than by direct elections of a world parliament.
I'm not taking that for granted. I think at least not in the first stages. So I'm much more pragmatic than this. That's one of the nice things about Kantian idea of regulative ideal. You can be as idealistic and utopian as you want, and at the same time, you don't want to give up your pragmatism or keeping your feet on earth and trying to see how things are and how they can be. So in the short run, of course, it's impossible to dream of organizing a global election in which every human being can vote. We are much farther than that. So the fact is, we have a tremendous global order, international order, that already exists, with thousands of international organizations that many people around the world simply ignore their existence. But there are thousands of international organizations with dozens of thousands of workers making decisions, yes, with no clear powers and no enforcement most of the times, and lacking many features of what we would recognize as a state. But all that already exists. And all those institutions, I would say, they are not even minimally democratic. So yes, at some point, if you are getting closer and closer to the ideal of a world republic, at some point we will confront the challenge of organizing global elections. In the meanwhile, the challenge for me is how to democratize what we already have, which is already a very hard task. So I think everything is about going step by step with a clear, more or less vague but clear idea of the horizon that you want to approach, and then you will see.
I think there is much consensus here about these points.
Yeah, I agree with that. Of course, the process is not linear, and one has to be, and I think this is where Rousseau comes in. I don't want to turn this into a festival for Rousseau. It's about Kant that we should talk. But the late Rousseau did exactly that. You know, the government of Poland is supposed to be federated, and Rousseau originally wanted to write the Educació Politique. The social contract is only the first part of a twofold work that Rousseau wanted to write, and the Educació Politique was about the federation of republics. He never wrote it. We can debate about that, but it's in the cards in Rousseau to go beyond. But what I think is dangerous is this sort of cosmopolitan progress. It should not be driven by judicial incrementalism and elite-driven judicial incrementalism, because what will happen, and Rousseau will remind you of this, political backlash. There has to be political ownership all along. And what we see in the European process is complicated, let alone the global justice order. So the European process is and it's in danger of political backlash, or at least it's, because too many of those progresses were elite-driven by judicial incrementalism and not by political ownership, by citizens upholding those institutions through their very participation and engagement. And this is where this comes in, and it's very important. So if this progress is to be consolidated and steady, it has to be political. It has to be at each and every step, owned by a citizenry. That is, and that's the danger. Certainly at the global level, you see all these, international institutions, and I agree. At a very technical level, they do an incredibly important work. We fly around the world because all these international aviation regulations work, and all of this, and communications work, etc., satellites, etc. So I agree with you on that. But when it comes to tough political decisions, solving conflicts, unless these processes are really owned by citizens, they will not be consolidated. And democracy is a complicated thing. Of course, we can think about a world republic, but that in any kind of functioning democracy, citizens have to be able to speak to each other. Now, you might say, okay, AI will bring us the global translation of everything simultaneously, and we'll have, but the public use of reason means that citizens speak to each other in a language they each of them understands. And the fact that we speak English here is already quite elitist, I think, and we need translation, etc. So this already shows how difficult it is at a very local European level, so to speak, and let alone at a global level. So, you know, this is what we have to keep in mind. Now, I agree with you on the regulative idea. That does not deny that the regulative idea that we have to have is some sort of, you know, mutuality, even at a very global level, and political ownership. But and it needs to be a political process. It can't just be a legal or technical process. Huh?
Fully agree. I think the Tower of Babel curse is still with us in constructing more integrative transnational political organizations. It's a very important point. I wanted to get back more in the second round, and then we open up for questions from the audience, with a brief question to each of you concerning how this all could affect or improve school education about democracy. And short questions from each of you. When should we start? What is the youngest age? Because it's always good to start as early as we can, and because that enables further structured, repeated practice. So what is the earliest age? Very simple question, very simple answers. When we should start with that. Secondly, I spoke yesterday about the fact that here in Spain we have a good political ecology in that we have 2 years of obligatory philosophy at schools. And here with this new project we are starting now in the first half of the first year to teach critical reasoning. Where would you, at what point in these 2 years would you locate a course on democracy, and how should it actually, what would be very concrete steps? How would you install this course and teach people better reasoning? Would it be about basic theories of what democracy is and what division of powers and what forms of government there are, the classics? Or should we put more emphasis on current challenges of good political reasoning about, like, what is groupthink? How do motivations in political discourse play a role? Where would you put the emphasis, and how would you integrate that? You are, imagine yourself being on the educational board of the Spanish or Catalan government, and you ought to make recommendations for where to put political philosophy into those 2 years. Francis, you want to go first?
Yes, of course. I'm anything but an expert on education, and I think in education it's very difficult and very important to get it right, that you don't overburden children with things too early. And also the school system, I think, you know, kids have to learn skills first, mathematics, language, etc. Following Rousseau again, I would say rather late, you know. Certainly after 12, 13 years it should come in. You shouldn't burden younger children with politics. They have other things to worry about and learn. I would bring it in later, certainly not before the age of 12. Again, I'm saying this under the reserve of not being a professional educator. And what I think something Daniel Gamper said last night is very important, and what you already said also, José Luis. Not the whole burden has to be on the schools. Schools will do what you do, Thomas, you know, skills, competencies, knowledge, to get people ready for the public use of reason, but then the rest is done by jumping in the water and being, you know, an active citizenry, and for that you need, of course, a active political life. Here again, I think it's easier to do this in Switzerland. We vote 4 times a year at the municipal, regional, cantonal, and national level. This is a debate every time, and people are just drawn into it quite naturally, and people have studied this empirically, so whenever there is a campaign, and you ask citizens at the beginning of the campaign, they know very little about an issue. At the end of a campaign, they know much more about the issue, and you see, so the public use of reason, debating these issues have had some effect. So I think part of it has to be done in school, but by far not everything. The rest has to be done by jumping into the water of political life, but then of course the institutions need to be there so the citizens can engage. And And an election every 4 years, I'm sorry, that's not enough. That will not get you a good citizenry, because just having a debate every 4 years, of course, that's not what's happening, but having a meaningful way to participate only every 4 years in an election, I think, is not enough.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a complex question, but I start with the easiest part, which makes me happy, because I think that for the first time we will clearly disagree. So you said later is better, and I would say earlier is better, clearly. So like you, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm happy that if anyone here in the room is an expert can contradict me. But so I can only tell you about my own experience with my son, who is now 17. I started trying to teach him the importance of democracy at the age of 2, 3. He didn't get anything, right? So he started, but not democracy. He couldn't understand any idea that was institutional. So he only understood interaction between individuals, but not institutional matters. So neither the law or democracy or anything like that was for him possible to understand. But at the age of 5 or 6, I realized that he was already open to some of these ideas. Of course, in a very basic level about how to make decisions in a group or in a collective, etc. Not explaining what is the Congress and the Senate and how we elect the members of the Senate. Not things like this, which is actually one of the mistakes when we think about teaching democracy. We think about teaching how the Congress works. That should come at the end, maybe when they are 17 or 16, but not before. And that's the boring part. But I think perhaps we don't disagree in the end. If I say now what I will going to say, because it all depends on what you mean by starting teaching them democracy. So I think that teaching democracy is teaching them certain values and certain attitudes, first of all, which need to be present in school from the very beginning. So when you do that, you are already starting to teach them democracy in some sense. Also, I think it's very important, and now, so if we have made any progress, I think, at least some people, maybe not everyone would agree, but if we have made any progress in the way we conceive or we approach this issue of democratic education or democracy in general, precisely comes from the fact that, as Francis was saying, elections every 4 years is not enough. We need to think about citizen engagement in a much more active way and permanent way and so on. Someone who needs to be engaged and informed all the time about political issues, and also participate politically at different levels in different contexts. One of them, actually, the school. So when we say, I agree with you, and I already said in my presentation, when we say experiential learning or learning by doing is fundamental, I agree. And in the case of kids, this might come in different ways. Let me just mention two, for me are very important. First of all, we should have the debate about political participation of children. So if we want them to learn to behave as good citizens, they need to do what citizens do. I'm not talking about lowering voting age, which probably you know there's a debate about. In many countries, they already have it at 16, the age of 16. We might discuss whether we should have it here, I don't know, in Switzerland, which is the voting age. Here it's 18, some countries it's 16. Some people propose it should be 12 or 14, I don't know. But that's not the most important part. The important part is let's allow them to participate in public deliberation, or in particular fora that are created for them, and they make them feel that they are participating with some kind of consequences. That's one thing. And the second thing, they should also, and sorry if there are teachers here in the room and you disagree, I would like to discuss with you, but take it as a respectful comment anyway. So schools themselves should be organized more democratically, and citizens should have a voice, a greater voice in the way in which the schools are organized, because that's the best way to teach them that every aspect of our life can be, in some sense, democratized. Of course, democratized differently. It's not that we should submit everything to referendum in schools or that they will ultimately decide. That's not the idea. But at least that they should have a say. So I know many schools where kids are constantly told that they cannot protest, or they cannot even express what they think when they disagree with some policy or some order or some instruction, because it's not what they have to do. They have simply to learn to obey, which is another insistence by Kant, which might be kind of compromised today, or at least should be detailed in a different way.
Thank you very much. Oh.
Yeah, I think this might be a misunderstanding, so we might agree more than you think, because there are, of course, two notions of democracy. There's just a notion of democracy as a social way of interacting, and then there's a more institutional notion of democracy. That's what I had in mind when I say this, the teaching about the importance of these institutions comes in late. Of course, we are socialized into a democratic kind of social interaction much before that, and then it's not even the school, it's, as you have said, it's the family that decides where to go hiking, you know, and then lets the kids have a say in this. Of course, I agree with you, that comes much earlier, and that comes also much earlier in school. A participatory way of interacting socially is of course very important. So I agree with you, but the institutional part I think should come later. To what extent everything should be democratized, that can be debated. I'm not sure, you can just evacuate authority out of any kind of setting. Sometimes parents have to take the decision where to go hiking, where to go on vacation, and that's the way it is.
Yeah, but
kids have to learn that
one of the nice things
they don't have their way every time.
So if there's maybe the public is not so aware about this, but the hegemonic, quasi-hegemonic theory of democracy today is deliberative democracy. Not that everyone agrees with that. There are other theories, but that's the massive theory that most theorists endorse today. It's important to acknowledge that it has clear Kantian foundations, that theory. And so the point is that you said that before. So the point is, for deliberative democracy, perhaps one of the most important contributions is to realize that when we talk about democratizing, we are not necessarily meaning that we should vote everything. That's not, so that's the overemphasis on voting that has been kind of, perhaps not, I was going to say disastrous, but maybe it played a role and it was good for some time, but now that's not the point anymore. So we need to make progress. And so when I say democratizing every aspect, I'm not saying we should vote everything horizontally with same rights to everyone. I mean, that's perhaps a superficial idea of democracy, but I think something that comes earlier, prior to any voting, is that you should discuss everything with the others. And discuss means that you should listen to what the others have to say and take seriously what they say, their arguments and so on. Everyone at his age or her age or her level of capacity. And that, I'm convinced, should be introduced everywhere, yeah?
We must democratize the conversation here and invite the audience for questions, please. Hands up. Hands up. Who would like to go first? Oh yeah, thank you. Now I can see the audience a little bit better. Well, 3, 2, oh yes, please, over there.
Yeah, coming back to teaching physics and philosophy, democracy, I find it's interesting that I can put an article in front of, like, physics is only physics, and then democracy, it's a democracy when it's for state forms. And I wonder that, like, when it comes to teaching this, like, how much that matters. Because, like you said, maybe we don't have a clear ideal how to be a perfect citizen, but I wonder how much we can achieve actually such kind of ideals, or whether it's more like indeed some kind of the handcraft that the people then have to do by themselves to identify that, what it means in their respective system, how to behave.
Yes, that's a very important question. Let me say two things. First, there's huge debates. Now, as I said, that there's an hegemonic theory of democracy, but that doesn't mean that there is no disagreement among those who endorse the theory. The disagreement is huge. And of course, there is no consensus about all the details. I thought I think that's what I tried to say before. That's one of the nice things about working with the regulative ideals. We don't need actually to agree with all the details. We need to agree on the basics, and that's what we can teach our kids. Because I think that you can be sure enough that will be enough for them to develop then, and that I come to my second point, which was discussed at length yesterday, which is the idea that that's fully Kantian idea, that we should teach our kids to develop their own critical thinking, the capacity to think for themselves, which includes, of course, the very Kantian ideas. So nothing should be taken for granted. Perhaps that's one of the first lessons, not from Kant, but I mean, from philosophy altogether, from the beginning of Western philosophy at least. Nothing should be a dogma here. Even those basics that I said, it's easily to agree on some basic foundations, even that should not be a dogma. And that's why any point of view should be welcome. So I normally criticize, just to come to concrete examples, I normally criticize the understandings of neutrality, especially political neutrality, that come, for instance, in a class, in a school, come to say, okay, in the world, there are different forms of organizing government. Some of them are democratic, some of them are authoritarian. Anything might go, in principle. You come here and develop your own ideas. I will not tell you what is good. Well, I don't think that's a good thing. So I think that in schools should clearly say that democracies are the only way of articulating power legitimately. This is compatible with very different understandings of democracy. But if you put it, at least in the extreme cases, the most clear cases of authoritarian regimes that are not legitimate governments. And these should be taught in the school. Now, what happens if one kid in the school says, but I like dictatorships and I like the government of Afghanistan or North Korea, the two countries in the world that are ranked as most authoritarian right now? If someone says so, the correct attitude by the teacher, of course, should be, okay, let's have a discussion about this. Please explain me your arguments in favor of that, and let's have a collective discussion. Maybe we can learn something from you. I'm sure you have something interesting to say about this. So let's discuss it. It's not that you should teach that even those extreme cases of authoritarian governments are bad or illegitimate as a dogma. Nothing should be taught as a dogma. There's no dogma in democracy, because one of the nice things in democracy is that you can discuss everything, every principle, even the constitutional principles.
Well, but I think the Kantian thing to say there would be the way you talk about it is not up for grabs. We heard this yesterday from Thomas. What a good argument is, what a sound argument is, what a coherent argument is not up for grabs. And that's why I think these kind of discussions with students have to be rather late than early, and you teach them mathematics first. Because the nice thing about mathematics and physics is the teacher and the students are equal before the laws of mathematics. The teacher doesn't invent them, he just finds them and explains them. And so there is no asymmetry of power between the teacher and the scholar vis-a-vis the laws of mathematics. There is an asymmetry of power between the student and the teacher when it comes to debating certain positions that are ideological, and that's why this has to come later, when the students also have acquired enough skills to hold against the teachers or to engage in a critical discussion with the teacher. If that comes too early, the asymmetry of power is too great, then the children are indoctrinated. This cannot be done with laws of mathematics, because they're the teacher. It's not the teacher's power who decides what a true a correct mathematical calculation is. The teacher and the students are equal in front of the law of mathematics. So, deliberative democracy, I agree with you, but the way what it means to have a good rather than a bad deliberation is not necessarily up for grabs. It's about logic and coherence, etc., and about inquiry. It's about epistemic virtues. Was your inquiry correct? Do you have a second source? Have you checked it? Have the data been run by somebody independently? Does this person come to the same or similar results? All of this all of this is not up for grabs. And so democracy is based on presuppositions that are not decided democratically, that are given in logic, in coherence, etc. And that's important to add, because otherwise, what you just said happens. People think, well, democracy, that's just everybody having an opinion and voicing an opinion just out of the blue. That's not what a good public use of reason is. It's presenting an argument, presenting data, verifying data, re-verifying data, etc. And that's what students have to learn, and that's how they learn. So, and then it's important to see deliberations usually do not lead to consensus, and because we have, circumstances of politics means we have to collectively act under conditions of dissent.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot indefinitely just deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where decision-making comes in, collective decision-making comes in, certain rules, majority rule, and then people have to learn, well, okay, there's a negative domain of democracy that is not up for grabs for democracy, but the things that we have agreed to vote on and that are reasonable to vote on, they're decided collectively, and if ideally by deliberation, and if dissent is still there, we need a collective decision rule, and then we have a democratic decision, and then it's important to have good democratic leadership that actually those who lose give their consent to the result.
But may I? So let me try to disagree with you for the third time, the third attempt to disagree with you. So I do think that everything is up for grabs in one sense. So of course I agree with you that deliberative democracy requires certain procedures, right? So you need to reason, to use your reason, exchange arguments and do it properly, and I agree with all that, especially ideally. That's how ideally works. Then we go into practice, and we learn that some people, for instance, some people have difficulties to express their views or their opinions in an articulated way. Maybe they don't have received a very high level of education, or maybe they have some cognitive disability. I'm working on a project on AI, and people with cognitive disabilities, they have a hard time to express what they want to say in a fully deliberative way, something that would go through the test of deliberation. But that doesn't mean that we should exclude them. So in practice, we need to also find a way to integrate these other ways of expressing views and try to do our best to turn them more deliberative, yes, because that's always the ideal. But nevertheless, don't rule them out. That's one thing. And the second thing is here on the idea of whether everything at the Constitution should be up for grabs or not. You know that many people think that some elements of the Constitution should not be up for grabs, and they should be out of the democratic reach. But that's not my position. I'm with Habermas on this as well. So everything should be discussed. We should be able to discuss about everything, every element of the Constitution, and change everything we want. At some point, this might lead us to some kind of paradox. Yes, maybe eventually we might have a deliberation and a vote and decide to change the Constitution and make it less democratic instead of making it more democratic. And that's kind of paradoxical. But I don't think that we should accept, because it's obvious that any constitution was decided sometime by someone at some moment. And I don't see any reason why that decision made by someone else in the past should freeze something and detract that from democratic deliberation and voting forever or for a period of time. I think that everything should be up to discussion. Even, as I said in the example, even those who have very extreme views about politics or about sexism or about racism or about these things, I'm of the opinion that we should have a discussion with them. Not simply say, I reject what you say, it's obviously wrong and immoral, and I'm not saying that you say that, but you hear many people saying, I would never discuss with a racist or with a Nazi or with whatever. I think we should discuss with them as well.
Yeah, no, that's a misunderstanding. Again, I didn't say the Constitution, of course, is a historical document. But what I mean in a more a Kantian sense, that certain a priori rules of thinking are not up for grabs.
But
The procedure.
if I may break through the moderator
Yeah.
position, Kant says actually that when we have learned to philosophize, we are not only artisans of reasons, we do not only know how to use certain existing rules of reasoning, we are also lawgivers of reason. We can learn to revise existing rules at a meta level of reflection. And I think that's a strong point of Kant to make. And I kind of like that. But I'm also very pragmatic about when that has to be done, under what circumstances, and for what subject matters. We always need good judgment. We need to exercise good judgment when this kind of radical democratic demand that Josep is making is acceptable and when it should end. I think that is an art form also that need to be, there's no science behind it, there's no mathematical theory for that, but it's something that we need to practice in school education and beyond. But I hope that there is one or two more questions. We will have a few more minutes if there is another question from the audience. Oh yes, please. Thank you.
Hola, bona nit. Primer que tot, excusar-me, he arribat mitja hora tard i per tant no sé exactament com ha anat la discussió sobre Rousseau i Kant, però Rousseau i Kant són profundament diferents perquè Rousseau era optimista sobre la naturalesa i pessimista sobre la història i en canvi Kant és pessimista sobre l'home i en canvi és molt optimista sobre la història. Llavors, el tema és l'educació per Kant, penso jo que s'ha d'entendre a partir d'una distinció que és bàsica, que estableix en el que és la il·lustració. El que és la il·lustració, per cert, s'acaba de traduir al català fa poc. Deia que Kant diferencia entre època il·lustrada i època d'il·lustració. Jo tinc la sensació que quan es parla de cosmopolitisme sempre s'oblida que Kant diu claríssimament que mai hi haurà una època il·lustrada, però sempre hi ha d'haver èpoques d'il·lustració. És a dir, que l'educació és un projecte i el cosmopolitisme és un projecte. És a dir, les llums, la filosofia de les llums no és una teoria. La filosofia de les llums és una direcció a seguir. I l'altra qüestió que em sembla que és molt important és que Kant, evidentment, en el Tractat de Pedagogia 438, diu que no hi pot haver educació si prèviament no hi ha tres elements: habilitat, prudència i moralitat. És a dir, tinc la sensació, i com jo he estat professor al batxillerat, a la universitat, 41 anys, soc fill de mestre, net de mestre i pare de mestre, i per tant alguna cosa sé. És a dir, a casa meva l'educació és una cosa que ens hi hem dedicat des de finals del segle XIX. Llavors jo tinc la sensació que últimament estem perdent la qüestió de les habilitats com a qüestió primària del coneixement. És a dir, Kant diu també una altra cosa que em sembla que és molt important quan parlem sobre educació. Diu que l'educació s'ha de fonamentar en la confiança i en la prohibició. Jo tinc la sensació que, almenys en els últims 10 anys que jo he estat profe, m'acabo de jubilar fa 3 anys, les prohibicions han anat desapareguent i també ha anat desapareguent la confiança. També ha anat desapareguent la confiança. Vivim en una societat globalment de l'espectacle. Vivim en una societat de l'espectacle on la confiança social cada vegada disminueix. I en el cas català, evidentment, això és claríssim, sobretot des del famós 1 d'octubre. La confiança social i política avui en dia estan mínims i només cal veure com està la política. Jo tinc com la sensació que quan estem parlant d'una educació kantiana estem perdent la perspectiva doble de Kant, que és confiança i prohibició. És a dir, han d'haver-hi prohibicions molt clares. A l'escola actual no hi són, ho sé segur perquè he estat 41 anys, i hi ha d'haver confiança social en les institucions. I la confiança social en les institucions tampoc existeix, i menys a Catalunya ara. Llavors, la meva sensació personal és que una educació kantiana ha de recuperar la confiança en la història. És a dir, si no recuperem la confiança en la història, que és com a direcció a seguir, ho tenim molt complicat perquè l'educació pugui funcionar amb uns mínims nivells de qualitat. I hi ha una altra qüestió encara, última, que m'agradaria dir, i és que a Espanya i a Catalunya hi ha un prejudici brutal contra la formació professional, que en canvi a Alemanya no existeix. Això és una part de la superioritat de l'educació alemanya sobre l'educació catalana. És a dir, Catalunya està governada per pijos des de fot exactament 50 anys, des de 1962. Llavors, aquest és un dels problemes més greus que té aquest país. Els que governen viuen a Pijolàndia, és un altre país. És allò de quiero vivir en teoria porque en teoria no hay problemas. Bé, doncs, la meva sensació personal, i voldria fer-vos aquesta pregunta, és: creieu que es pot recuperar d'alguna manera la disciplina i la confiança com a característiques bàsiques de l'educació kantiana en un projecte, diguéssim, a mig termini?
Okay. So, in English or in Catalan?
I think we should stick to English. Yes.
English? Okay. So it's a hard question, of course, and I don't have. I guess I don't have. I'm afraid I don't have a clear insight to share with you. But I think you're right that having the, Kantian insistence on having discipline and rules and order and prohibitions, that should be part of education. I think that you might think, I don't know enough, so you surely know better how schools work, but perhaps we have gone too far on certain issues. At the same time, I think that we had, as far as I can tell, we took certain paths that were also important, because we come from a kind of education that also had its own failures. So I'm especially against romanticizing the past and thinking that schools or governments or whatever other aspect of social life was much, much better 50 years ago or 70 years ago or even 20 years ago. I don't think that is true, generally true. There might be exceptions, but I disagree with that. And because I'm an optimistic person, maybe that's not helpful to you, but because I'm an optimistic person, my answer would be yes. Of course we have the capacity to change the way we educate and make it more Kantian in that sense. And also, I think that we should change it. But I agree with you, especially on one thing, which is the fundamental importance of trust on institutions. And that's perhaps one of the main symptoms of the crisis of democracy. Not so much the poor debate that we can have on social media, we find in social media, the misinformation, the polarization. These are terrible things. But I don't think that they don't necessarily put democracy at crisis. What puts democracy in crisis is the idea that citizens don't trust the democratic institutions. If citizens don't trust parliaments and governments, then we can hardly say that we still live in a democracy. So that should be taken really, really seriously. And we should not leave all the discussion about what to do to political parties, because that's a debate that citizens mostly should have. So I agree that this should be also taken seriously in schools.
Would you like to add something or no? Good. Is there another question there? But very short, please.
Jo voldria recordar que Kant diu que perquè hi pugui haver confiança en l'educació, el mestre ha de ser imparcial. La imparcialitat és la condició a través de la qual el mestre pot garantitzar que la disciplina a la classe és per tothom igual. Clar, quan estem començant a parlar d'educació per la diversitat, quan estem començant a parlar de multiculturalisme, això en una aula és molt més complicat. Simplement fer aquesta observació empírica, perquè forma part de la meva experiència personal. És a dir, el problema de la imparcialitat en política, el problema de la imparcialitat en les decisions pedagògiques, per exemple, quan estem començant a regalar aprovats a manta, s'està regalant d'una manera brutal. Els últims 10 anys de l'ensenyament han sigut patètics, horribles. Jo ho sé perquè hi era. A mi això no m'ho heu d'explicar, us ho puc explicar a vosaltres. Llavors, la meva sensació és que ha passat una mica el mateix en les institucions. És a dir, la imparcialitat en les institucions avui en dia és absolutament qüestionable. I això porta a una crisi social, que serà una crisi d'educació, però també una crisi moral molt forta. Simplement constatar això i res més.
Just briefly, and so Francis may close this. So just briefly about the importance of diversity. Yes, diversity in class puts a lot of challenges and makes the life of teachers harder, because it creates more situations in which you need to teach impartially, as you said. But I think my inclination is that is a good thing. Of course, it creates trouble in the short run, but that is a good thing. And again, insisting on my idea that we should not romanticize the past, our citizens were always diverse. Now they are more racially diverse, they are more linguistically diverse, they are more diverse in terms of the countries in which they are born, because we have more immigrants. But they were always diverse in the sense that we always had richer students and poorer students, or more intelligent students and less intelligent students, or people who were more shy and less inclined to talk, or people who were very expressive and proactive and so on. And this diversity was always a challenge for professors. The truth is that if you look backwards in the history of schooling, it was normally not taken into account, and then professors tended to get a uniformized way of teaching, and then that was for the exclusion of certain kind of diverse people. So I think it's good that we have more diversity. It's a challenge, it's a further challenge, and we need to learn how to teach impartially. It's very difficult. I mean, being a professor is super difficult. All my admiration for professors, and as I said, these questions are all hard. That's why it's important that we discuss them.
Thank you very much. Francis, in addition?
Not really. I agree very much. I think teachers have to deal with a lot these days, but I agree with you. You know, the school wasn't better 40, 50 years ago than is it now. It had different problems. Maybe what is also important when we think about education, and I'm a liberal, but I always go very far in defending public education, because it's the level playing field that has to be given before people are then engaged in social interaction that where they have to, you know, face inequalities. So I think public education is very important, and public education does not only mean to have public schools, it means a lot more. For instance, when you think about rich and poor and diversity, we have to design our neighborhoods in a way so that they're not ghettos. The rich are here and the poor are here and the middle class is here, and then here's a poor school, here's a rich school, here's a middle class school. Public education means to have public planning and zoning that fights these kind of formations of ghettos. So the problem goes much further than that. So I think school should be the place where, you know, people from different walks of life and social strata meet and are educated and confronted with this and learn to socially interact. So it's very important for the reproduction of democracy to have public schools that are mixed, not only mixed in any kind of sense, but certainly also when it comes to social strata, etc. And that requires more than just a good, you know, educational plan. It means having a good zoning plan, etc. City planning. It goes much further than that, and I think we should avoid. We have more. I don't know how it is in Spain. In Switzerland, I went to school, and you know, some of my fellow students were, you know, very relatively from lower social strata, higher social strata, and public school is where, because it was about performance, is where all these people got a fair chance, and also learned to interact with each other and become friends across any kind of racial or social strata that might separate them otherwise. That's why I defend public school, but in a strong sense of public. It can also be good regulation of private schools if you have private schools. In some countries, I know that that's very prevalent. It can't be changed from one day to the next. But I think, and my children went to public schools in Geneva, 70% foreigners in the neighborhood. It worked because the school did a big effort in turning that diversity into richness, you know, it's nice. We have students can talk to each other and tell each other very different experiences from different parts of the world, different languages, different cultures, different religions. That can be turned into an enriching exercise, but it has to be done in good faith, of course, and with efforts, and also putting prohibitions, you know, making sure people have to play by the rules, etc. So there's a need for, like Kant is very right. This will create trust, but you need rules, and you have to be strict about certain things. There's a no-go areas for the students. So yeah, maybe that's just a small.
My experience is that if children have that teenagers in particular have a very keen sense of when rules are being violated, and they protest against that, because it it contradicts their natural inclination, not of all teenagers, but of a large number of teenagers, to be idealistic about how society should function. Most teenagers have that at the beginning, and then that expectation meets real life in many ways. The second thing that I wanted to say is, I said yesterday, the human being is the only being that needs to be educated, because we need to get out of our animal nature and develop forms of social life that go beyond anything that you meet in the animal kingdom. And Kant adds to this the Rousseauian paradox that who educates the human being is yet another human being. So the process is indeed necessarily imperfect. And we are in a changing world and changing society, so we need to reflect on how to improve our educational systems. The last I wanted to say 3 days, no, but it was only 2 days. The last 3 debates were a wonderful experience. I thank all of the participants, but in particular our 2 participants for today, Francis and Jose, and I would like you to join me in applauding them one more time. But joining also the speakers who are still there from yesterday's discussion. This was a wonderful experience, and I thank everyone in the audience for coming here and participating in our debates. And I'm very sure, at least as far as I am concerned, if you have questions and you feel you want to answer us more than me, but also our participants are open to receiving those questions, that's one good thing that we have the internet today, that we can continue discussions that we have started here and that do not necessarily have to end. And maybe you have good ideas about how to improve school education for, as Kant would say, the progress of humankind. Thank you very much for coming over here, and have a good evening.